The shovel sliced into the cold, resistant soil, a metallic scrape that was swallowed by the immense quiet of the valley. Each scoop of dark earth, smelling of deep frost and sleeping roots, was a small victory against the coming winter. Elias worked with a rhythm that was not hurried but inevitable, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving under his worn wool shirt with the steady persistence of a river current. Beside the growing trench, a large, brindle-coated dog with intelligent amber eyes sat perfectly still, his head cocked. The dog, Boro, watched every movement, his breath pluming in the sharp November air. He did not question the digging, the strange, long scar that grew day by day from the back of the small stone cottage toward the dense line of pine trees. He simply witnessed. It was a trench 3 feet wide and 8 feet deep, a monumental undertaking for one man and a shovel. By the third week, it stretched over 50 feet, its earthen walls shored up with rough-hewn pine timbers Elias had felled and milled himself. He worked from the first pale light of dawn until the sky turned a bruised purple at dusk, stopping only to eat a block of cheese and hard bread, sharing a piece with Boro, who took it gently from his calloused fingers. The first voice of doubt came from his nearest neighbor, Mr. Gable, a man whose face was a roadmap of 70 hard winters. He leaned on the split-rail fence that separated their properties, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing, son?" Gable asked, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Digging your own grave before the snow flies? That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You've got a perfectly good cottage your grandfather left you." Elias paused, resting one hand on the handle of the shovel. He looked at the old man, his gaze even. "I have a plan," he said. His voice was quiet, not much more than a murmur, but it held no uncertainty. "A plan?" Gable scoffed, shaking his head. "A plan to catch your death of cold, maybe. Wait until the first hard freeze. That ground will be like iron. Wait until the snow fills that ditch. You'll be shoveling until spring just to find your tools. What's it even for?" "It's a tunnel," Elias answered simply. Gable stared, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "A tunnel? A tunnel to where? China? You've been alone too long since the old man passed, Elias. It's addled your brain." Elias did not argue. He did not explain. He simply turned back to his work, driving the shovel back into the earth. The sound of the scraping metal was his only reply. Mr. Gable watched for another minute, then turned and walked back to his own sensible, well-maintained farmhouse, the smoke rising from its chimney in a straight, confident line. The knowledge Elias was working from was not his own, not entirely. It came from a leather-bound journal his grandfather had kept, its pages filled with elegant, spidery script and detailed diagrams. His grandfather had been a scholar of old ways, of forgotten engineering. He wrote of geothermal principles, of how the earth below the frost line maintains a near constant temperature, a vast, stable reservoir of mildness. He called it the earth lung, a system that could breathe in the bitter cold through one vent, warm it deep in the ground, and exhale it as temperate air into a dwelling. It was theory, a lifetime of observation and calculation that he never had the strength in his final years to build. On the last page, in a shakier hand, he had written, "They will call it madness, but the earth remembers how to keep its children warm." Elias was honoring that memory. He was translating theory into sweat and soil and stone. He worked through the first dustings of snow, his hands cracking and bleeding in the cold, taping them with strips of cloth and carrying on. Boro would often nudge a cold nose into his palm, as if to check the damage, his amber eyes full of a deep, unspoken trust that was the opposite of the valley's growing skepticism. The next to comment was Mr. Sterling, who owned the largest tract of land in the valley, and a new, modern house with a furnace that burned through heating oil at an astonishing rate. He drove his truck up the lane to Elias's cottage, idling the loud engine as he leaned out the window. "Gable tells me you're building a tunnel," Sterling said, a smirk playing on his lips. He was a man who measured worth in dollars and common sense, and he saw none of either in the long, ugly ditch scarring the landscape. "What's the goal, son? Hiding from your creditors? Or just trying to invent a new way to break your back?" "It'll work," Elias said, not breaking his rhythm of laying fieldstones for the tunnel floor. "Work to do what?" Sterling pressed, enjoying the spectacle. "Give the moles a highway? I just put in a new generator. Cost me $1,700. Power goes out, my heat stays on. That's a plan. What you're doing? That's just digging." He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the trees, and drove away, leaving the scent of diesel fumes hanging in the clean, cold air. Mrs. Gable brought him a pot of stew one evening, her face etched with genuine concern. "Elias, dear," she said, her voice soft, "you're working too hard. You're thin as a rail. Please, come inside when the big snows come. You can't live in a hole in the ground." "I won't have to," Elias told her, accepting the stew with a grateful nod. "This is my home." He gestured, not just to the cottage, but to the trench, the piles of timber, the stacks of stone. It was all one thing to him. She sighed, patting his arm. "Your grandfather was a dreamer too. Just be careful." The only person who didn't mock or pity him was Clara, the Gables' daughter, who had returned from the city to help her aging parents. She came by one afternoon, not with advice or warnings, but with a thermos of hot coffee and a quiet curiosity. She stood at the edge of the trench, watching him carefully fit a heavy capstone over a section of the walled tunnel. "It's like building a ship upside down," she said, her eyes tracing the careful joinery of the timbers. Elias looked up, surprised. He was so used to defending the project that a simple observation felt like a validation. "It has to hold the weight," he said. "The earth is heavy." "What did your grandfather call it?" she asked, her gaze perceptive. "This doesn't seem like something you just came up with." "An earth lung," he said, and for the first time he explained it. He showed her the diagrams in the journal, his finger tracing the airflow from the tall intake stack he planned to build at the far end, down into the earth, through the long stone channel, and into the cottage's cellar. He explained how a smaller exhaust flue, warmed by the wood stove, would create a gentle, continuous draw, pulling the frigid air in and sending naturally warmed air out. She listened, nodding slowly, her eyes wide with understanding, not ridicule. "It's brilliant," she said softly. "It's so simple. It has to be." From then on, she visited almost daily, sometimes with food, sometimes just to watch. Her presence was a silent counterpoint to the whispers and jokes that circulated through the valley. Boro, who was wary of most strangers, would rest his head on her knee as she sat on a log, watching Elias work. By mid-December, the main tunnel, 150 feet of it, was complete and buried. The landscape was scarred with a long mound of raised earth, already covered in a thin blanket of snow. At the far end, near the woods, a 10-foot-tall fieldstone chimney rose into the sky, the cold air intake. At the cottage end, the tunnel opened into the stone-lined cellar. The final, crucial piece was the entrance. Elias didn't just seal the opening. He built a small, south-facing greenhouse over it, its angled glass panes designed to capture the weak winter sun, creating a passive solar collector that would give the air entering his home an initial boost of warmth. The valley residents saw it as the final monument to his folly. A glass house in a place that saw 6 feet of snow, a chimney with no fireplace, a tunnel to nowhere. They watched him finish the last of his work, stacking the final cords of firewood, securing his shutters, and then, as the first great storm of the season began to gather in the bruised northwestern sky, he and Boro disappeared into the small stone cottage. "Well, that's that," Mr. Gable remarked to his wife, watching the first heavy flakes drift down. "We'll have to check on him in the morning. Make sure the poor fool hasn't frozen solid." The storm did not arrive gently. It came like an invading army, a blizzard of historic fury that the old-timers would later call the White Hurricane. The wind shrieked, a physical force that tore at roofs and shattered windows. Snow fell not in flakes but in blinding horizontal sheets, erasing the world, burying fences, roads, and cars under monolithic drifts. The temperature plummeted, dropping to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. The wind chill made it feel like 70 below. It was a cold that killed, a cold that found every crack, every weakness, and broke them. Inside Elias's cottage, the world was quiet. The only sound was the soft crackle of the wood stove, which he kept burning low and steady, and the gentle sigh of air moving from a new vent he had cut into the floorboards. Earlier, he had gone into the cellar, Boro at his heels, and opened the heavy wooden door that connected to the tunnel. A current of air, cool but not cold, began to flow into the cellar, drawn by the thermal draft of the stovepipe. It was the earth lung, taking its first breath. He hung a thermometer on a nail just inside the vent. The air coming out of the ground was a steady 54 degrees. Mixed with the radiant warmth of the small fire, the temperature inside the little cottage settled and held. He checked the old thermometer on the wall, the one his grandfather had always trusted. It read 71 degrees. Boro, who should have been curled tightly against the hearth, was instead stretched out on the braided rug in the middle of the room, belly up and paws twitching in a dream. Elias sat in his grandfather's armchair, the journal open in his lap, and listened to the storm trying to tear his world apart. But it could not touch him. He was safe. He was warm. It had worked. For 2 days the blizzard raged. The valley was cut off from the world, a pocket of desperate cold. At the Gable farmhouse, the wind had driven snow so hard against the north-facing wall that it had forced its way through the old window frames, forming drifts in their living room. Worse, a massive drift had buried their chimney stack. The smoke, with nowhere to go, began to pour back into the house. Mr. Gable had no choice but to extinguish the fire. The cold flooded the home almost instantly. Wrapped in every blanket they owned, they huddled together, the temperature in the room dropping to the 40s, then the 30s. "We're not going to make it," Mrs. Gable whispered, her teeth chattering. Mr. Gable, his pride frozen and brittle, knew she was right. There was only one possibility, a chance so absurd he had mocked it for months. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. "I'm going to get Elias." The journey of 200 yards was a life-threatening expedition. He could barely see 5 feet in front of him, the wind a solid wall he had to shoulder his way through. The snow was waist-deep, and he fell again and again, his hope dwindling with each step. He was guided only by a faint orange glow he could sometimes see through the maelstrom, the light in Elias's window. When he finally stumbled against the cottage door, he was covered in ice, his beard a frozen mass, his hands too numb to knock. He simply fell against the wood. The door opened immediately. Elias stood there, wearing only his wool shirt and trousers, a look of calm concern on his face. Behind him, the warm, golden light spilled out into the screaming blizzard. Gable stared, dumbfounded at the impossible sight. It was like peering into a summer afternoon. "My fire is out," Gable managed to say, his words slurring from the cold. The chimney. My wife. Elias didn't hesitate. Get inside, he said, pulling the old man into the warmth. He sat him in the armchair, wrapped him in a thick blanket, and handed him a steaming mug of coffee from the stove. Burrow came over and laid his heavy head on Gable's knee. The old man began to weep, from relief, from shame, from the sheer, shocking comfort of the heat. I have to get Clara and my wife, he stammered. I'll go, Elias said. He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf over his face, and took a coil of rope from a hook by the door. Show me the way. Tethered together, they fought their way back to the Gables' frozen house. They found Clara and her mother huddled in the kitchen, the coldest room in the house but the one furthest from the failing chimney. Leading them back, one by one, along the rope line, Elias brought them out of the deadly cold and into the sanctuary he had built. Clara entered the cottage and stopped, her eyes taking in the scene. The incredible, enveloping warmth, the calm. The thermometer on the wall reading 71 degrees. She looked at Elias, her expression full of an emotion too deep for words. He had not just built a tunnel, he had built a harbor. They were not the only ones. Later that night, a frantic pounding came at the door. It was Mr. Sterling, his face pale with fear, his expensive parka already stiffening with frost. My generator's out of fuel, he said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. The pipes burst an hour ago. My house, it's freezing, it's full of ice. He looked past Elias into the miraculous warmth, his eyes wide with disbelief. How is this possible? Come in, Elias said, stepping aside. The five of them, three of his most vocal skeptics and the one woman who had believed, spent the next 2 days in the small stone cottage. They shared Elias's food, drank his coffee, and soaked in the impossible heat that flowed endlessly from the earth. They listened to the storm howl, but its voice was distant, a threat that could no longer reach them. Mr. Gable sat by the floor vent, holding his hand over the gentle current of air. He looked up at Elias, his eyes clear. It works, he said, his voice full of awe. He was not just stating a fact, he was offering an apology, an admission, a testament. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the world was a transformed place, silent and buried under a sea of white. The valley was isolated, but the community, starting with the 5 survivors in the cottage, had also been transformed. The news of what Elias had done, of the impossible haven he had created, spread as the neighbors began to shovel their way back to connection. They came to see it for themselves, trudging through massive drifts to stand in his doorway and feel the warmth. They looked at the simple vent in the floor, at the greenhouse, at the distant intake stack, and they saw not folly, but genius. Mr. Sterling, humbled and grateful, approached Elias with a checkbook in his hand. I owe you my life, he said. Name a price. I want to build one of these. I'll pay you whatever you want. Elias looked at the checkbook, then at the faces of his neighbors gathered around. Keep your money, he said quietly. But if you have a strong back and you're willing to learn, I'll show you how to build your own. We'll do it together. And so they did. That spring, the valley echoed with the sound of shovels scraping against stone. It was a communal effort. Elias, no longer the quiet outcast, became the teacher. He walked from homestead to homestead, sharing his grandfather's journal, explaining the principles of airflow and thermal mass. Gable, his skepticism replaced by a zealous faith, became his most ardent student and assistant. Sterling used his wealth to buy timber and tools for anyone who needed them. They were no longer just neighbors. They were a community, bound by the shared goal of survival, of listening to the earth. The years passed. 10 winters came and went, each with its own furies, but the white hurricane was never forgotten. It became the benchmark against which all other storms were measured, and the valley was always prepared. Nearly every home now had an earth lung, a testament to the quiet boy who had listened to his grandfather. The tunnels, once a subject of ridicule, were now a source of immense pride, a defining feature of their valley. They were a symbol of their resilience, of their willingness to embrace an old idea in a new world. Elias and Clara married in the small valley church. They built their life in the stone cottage, raising 2 children who grew up understanding that the earth was not something to be conquered, but a partner to be respected. They played in the greenhouse on cold winter days and knew the tunnel not as a strange structure, but as the source of their home's constant, gentle warmth. Boro grew old. His brindle muzzle turned gray, and his movements became slow and deliberate. He spent his final years sleeping in his favorite spot on the rug, in the steady 71-degree warmth he had watched his master dig from the frozen ground. One winter morning, he did not wake up. He passed peacefully in his sleep, in the heart of the sanctuary he had witnessed being built. Elias carried his old friend, wrapped in a blanket, and buried him beneath a young pine tree near the greenhouse entrance, marking the spot with a simple, smooth river stone. He had been a loyal witness, the first believer. Time continued its steady, relentless march. The children grew up and had families of their own. Elias's hair turned the color of snow, and his hands, though still strong, were mapped with the scars and calluses of a life of meaningful labor. He became the new Mr. Gable, the valley elder, the keeper of the knowledge. He would sit with the young families, his grandfather's journal open on his lap, its pages soft and worn as old cloth, and he would explain once again how to listen to the earth. He lived a long and full life, and when he died peacefully in his 87th year, it was in the same armchair where he had waited out the great blizzard decades before. The entire valley mourned his passing. They buried him on the small hill overlooking the cottage, next to Clara, who had passed a few years earlier. They did not erect a grand monument. It wasn't his way. Instead, they chose a large, flat piece of granite, pulled from the same earth he had understood so well. Mr. Gable's grandson, a stonemason, carved the epitaph. It was simple, just a few words that captured the essence of the quiet man who had saved them all. It read, "Elias Thorne, he taught us to listen to the earth." Decades later, long after the names of the skeptics and believers had faded into memory, the structures remained. On the coldest winter days, when the wind howled and the snow piled in deep, impassable drifts, a collection of small stone chimneys could be seen poking through the white landscape of the valley, each one steadily, silently, breathing in the bitter cold. And in the homes they were connected to, families gathered in the gentle, constant warmth. A young girl, Elias's great-granddaughter, would place her hand over the vent in the floor of the old stone cottage and feel the soft, warm breath of the earth lung, a legacy not of stone and timber, but of quiet persistence, of unconventional wisdom, and of a promise kept to an old man in a journal. The tunnel, once a madman's ditch, had become the valley's heartbeat. It worked. It had always worked.